Okay, in the month of August, I attended a conference that's hosted by the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City, and I presented a paper and I brought to the Fed officials who were in that meeting and a very, very important message, a message I thought was important, having to do with housing and the business cycle. In fact, that was the title of the paper that they asked me to present. And for whatever reason, macroeconomics has not noticed, and the Fed seems not to have noticed very adequately, that housing, although not very important in terms of long-run growth, is the most important sector when it comes to the recessions. It's the only sector in the economy that consistently gives us an early warning sign that there's going to be a recession. We've had 10 alarm bells rung off with a weak housing sector similar to what we have now, and 8 of those 10 led into recessions. 2 did not. You can call those false alarms, but in 1967 there was very great weakness in housing. An alarm went off, but weakness in housing was offset by the big ramp up in spending by the Department of Defense for the Vietnam War. So although that was a false positive, it was a correct alarm. And then again in 1951, housing was very weak, and it looked like based on housing we were going to go into a recession. But also in 1951, the Department of Defense ramped up spending big time, in that case for the Korean War. So housing has been a near perfect predictor that there's going to be trouble ahead. And anybody who's interested in controlling the cycle, which is one of the Fed's jobs, needs therefore to focus especially on the housing sector. And housing is very different from inflation. The other big problem that the Fed faces is to make sure inflation doesn't get off target. The Fed really has 2 tasks, which is to control inflation and keep the cycle not so frequent and not so deep so that employment continues to grow in the U.S. economy. But the control of inflation is very, very different from control of housing. For inflation, there's a very serious problem with persistence. Once it gets going, it just keeps going and going. So the Fed has to fight that every day or choose intense fights to try to stop that from getting out of control. For housing, it's not the housing itself that's persistent, it's the cycle that's persistent. Once it gets going, it continues to go, or it tends to continue to go. To fight the cycle, the Fed needs to intervene at just the right points in time. It's a little bit like pushing your daughter on a swing. She's swinging back and forth. You choose one particular point in the cycle to do that pushing, because you know that's when it has the most impact. The same thing is true with controlling the housing cycle. The right time for the Fed to intervene is when housing starts are normal but starting to rise, and the Fed ought to at that time rein it in a little bit to try to keep that rise a little less than it would be, because inevitably if we build too many homes and we have too much appreciation of homes, we're going to get a turnaround with substantial decline in building like we're having now and a weakness in home prices. And the way to prevent that is have very forward-looking Fed policy that intervenes at just the right point in the cycle. That is when things are pretty good but getting even better. That's when the Fed has to jump in and say, no more of that. Right now we're in a situation in which housing starts are fairly normal, but they're plummeting. And home prices are way high, but they're falling. In this kind of environment, the Fed has very little impact because of small rate cut like we're likely to have today, as a matter of fact, which September 18. That small rate cut isn't going to save the housing sector. So we're going to have a timeout and have really a deep recession when it comes to housing. The Fed, in my opinion, would do us all a favor, not just the folks in the housing sector, would do us all a favor if it were to concentrate a lot of its psychic energy on smoothing out that housing cycle. Now the response, which I've already made a reference to, the response is the Fed's job is not to take care of one particular sector in the economy. It's not going to focus on housing. But that's not what I'm calling for. I'm not calling for a focus on housing per se, but rather my argument is that the housing plays such an important role in this cycle. That plus consumer durables are really what the pathology is all about. If the Fed wanted to smooth out the cycle, then it would take much more notice of the cycle in houses and in consumer durables for that matter.